I want to start with something honest, something that I think most people in my position are reluctant to say clearly in public, because it invites misinterpretation from every direction simultaneously. I am not an atheist. And I am not a theist. I am an agnostic, and I want to be very precise about what that means. Because agnosticism is often misunderstood as a kind of intellectual cowardice, as sitting on the fence, as being too afraid to commit to a position, as saying, I don't know because it's safer than saying, I do know. That is not what I mean. What I mean is something epistemically precise and intellectually honest. I mean that the question of whether God exists is genuinely beyond what the available evidence can definitively resolve. Not because the question is unimportant, not because I haven't thought about it carefully, but because the specific claims that different conceptions of God make about reality span a range from empirically refutable to empirically untestable to genuinely uncertain. And intellectual honesty requires treating each of these claims according to what the evidence actually supports, rather than according to what is most emotionally comfortable. Tonight, I want to take you through this question the way I would take you through any other deep question about the nature of reality, with the full force of what physics and cosmology and evolutionary biology and philosophy of mind actually tell us, without pulling punches in either direction, without reassuring the religious that science confirms their faith, or reassuring the atheist that science has settled the matter, because neither is true. And the honest picture is more interesting than either comfortable versions. Let me start at the beginning. What does physics actually say about whether God is necessary to explain the universe? The strongest and most frequently cited argument for God's existence in the context of modern science is the cosmological argument in its various forms. The universe exists. Everything that exists has a cause. Therefore, the universe has a cause. That cause, which must itself be uncaused or self-caused, is God. This argument has serious force. The universe clearly exists. The existence of the universe demands explanation in the sense that it seems like something that requires an account. Why is there something rather than nothing? This question doesn't go away just because you're a physicist. In fact, the more physics you know, the sharper the question becomes. But here's where I want to push back on the simple version of the cosmological argument. The premise that everything that exists has a cause is not actually supported by our best current physics. Quantum mechanics has fundamentally revised our understanding of causation at the microscopic level. In quantum mechanics, events can occur without classical causes. Radioactive decay happens without any prior physical state determining exactly when it will happen. A uranium nucleus sits there and at some moment it decays. Not because something pushed it over the edge at that specific moment, because quantum mechanics is fundamentally probabilistic. The decay happens when it happens with a certain probability per unit time. And there is no deeper physical fact that determines the specific moment. It's genuinely random in a way that has no prior cause. More relevant for the cosmological argument is vacuum fluctuations. Quantum field theory describes a vacuum not as empty space, but as a seething foam of virtual particles and antiparticles constantly popping in and out of existence. These fluctuations are not caused by anything in the classical sense. They arise from the quantum nature of the fields. They happen because quantum mechanics permits them, not because something caused them in the way we usually mean cause. This has led some physicists and cosmologists, including Alexander Vilenkin, to argue that the universe itself could have arisen from a quantum fluctuation, from a state of quantum nothingness that is not the same as absolute philosophical nothingness, but is something like the quantum vacuum before any universe existed. The universe tunneled into existence from a state of zero energy through quantum mechanical processes that require no prior cause in the classical sense. Now, I want to be careful here. This is genuinely speculative. We don't have a confirmed theory of quantum gravities. we don't fully understand what happened at the Planck epoch. The no-boundary proposal of Hawking and Hartle describes a universe without a beginning in the conventional sense. But these are theoretical proposals, not established facts. What they establish is this: the claim that the universe requires an external cause, a God to bring it into existence, is not obviously true, given what we know about quantum mechanics. The universe arising from quantum fluctuations without an external cause is at least a coherent physical possibility that our current best theories do not rule out. Does this prove there is no God? Absolutely not. It just removes the most straightforward version of the necessity arguments. It shows that God is not required by the physics to explain the existence of the universe. Now, let me address fine-tuning, because it's the argument that I think has the most genuine scientific weight behind it and deserves the most careful treatment. The physical constants of the universe, the gravitational constant, the strong nuclear force, the electromagnetic coupling constant, the cosmological constant, appear to be set at values that permit the existence of complex structures like stars and planets and chemistry and biology. If the gravitational constant were slightly stronger, stars would burn out too quickly for life to develop on orbiting planets. If the strong nuclear force were slightly weaker, atomic nuclei would not hold together, and there would be no atoms beyond hydrogen. If the cosmological constant were orders of magnitude larger, the universe would have expanded too fast for any structure to form at all. The apparent fine-tuning of these constants is real. It's not a creationist fabrication. It's a genuine feature of the physics that has been noted by serious physicists, including people with no religious motivation whatsoever. Fred Hoyle, who was a committed atheist, was so struck by the resonance energy of carbon, that just happened to permit the nucleosynthesis of carbon in stars, that he wrote the universe looked like it had been put up by a super intellect. That's not a religious statement. It's an expression of genuine scientific puzzlement about why the constants are what they are. So what does fine-tuning actually tell us? The most honest answer is that it tells us the constants are compatible with complexity. It doesn't tell us the constants were chosen for that purpose. There's a logical gap between the universe being compatible with our existence and the universe being designed for our existence. Let me make this concrete with an analogy. If I shuffle a deck of cards and deal out a specific sequence of 52 cards, the probability of that exact sequence is 1 inch 52 factorial. That's roughly 1 inch 8 times 10 to the 67th. Vanishingly small, almost impossible. And yet there the sequence is, did someone arrange it? Not necessarily. Some sequence had to come out. The improbability of any specific outcome doesn't imply design. Now, you might say that's different from fine-tuning, because with fine-tuning, we're not just asking about one improbable sequence. We're asking about constants that happen to fall in a narrow range compatible with life, rather than in the vastly larger range incompatible with life. This is a more sophisticated version of the argument, and it deserves a more sophisticated response. The multiverse is that response. If our universe is one of an enormous or even infinite number of universes, each with different values of the physical constants, then it's not surprising that at least one of them has constants compatible with complex life. We find ourselves in one of those because we couldn't exist in the others. The anthropic principle explains our position in a multiverse without invoking design. Now, here's my honest assessment of this response. The multiverse is a genuine prediction of inflationary cosmology and string theory. It's not invented specifically to avoid the fine-tuning argument. It arises independently from our best current physics. Whether the string landscape contains the right number and variety of possible universes to make our universe's constants unsurprising is an active area of research. But the multiverse is also currently untestable in any direct way. We cannot observe other universes. We cannot confirm or disconfirm their existence through direct observation. The multiverse is a theoretical prediction rather than an established empirical fact. Does fine-tuning prove God exists? No. Can the multiverse definitively explain fine-tuning? Not yet. This is one of the genuinely open questions in cosmology and physics. And intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that it's open rather than claiming either side has definitively won. What I can say is that God is not the only explanation for fine-tuning. The multiverse provides an alternative naturalistic explanation that arises from physics. We have independent reasons to take seriously. The existence of an alternative doesn't refute the design hypothesis, but it means we're not forced to choose between accepting the design argument and accepting an explanation-free brute fact about the universe. Let me now address the most common misunderstanding I encounter in discussions of science and God. The assumption that science is fundamentally antagonistic to religion. That if you accept the findings of science, you must reject religious belief. That the two are inevitably at war. This is historically inaccurate and conceptually confused. And I want to explain why carefully, because I think the confusion has been damaging both to science communication and to serious religious thought. Science is a method, a specific set of practices for investigating claims about the physical world. The method requires that claims be testable by observation and experiment, that the evidence be reproducible, that simpler explanations be preferred over more complex ones when both fit the data equally well. These are not anti-religious principles. They're methodological principles for reliably discovering truths about the physical world. Religion in its various forms makes many kinds of claims. Some of those claims are about the physical world, the age of the earth, the origin of species, the mechanism of disease, the structure of the cosmos. These claims can be evaluated against scientific evidence. And when they have been evaluated, the results have been clear. The earth is not 6,000 years old. Species arose through evolution. Disease is caused by microorganisms and genetic factors, not by divine punishment. The universe was not created 6,000 years ago with the appearance of age, where religious claims about the physical world contradict the scientific evidence. I think intellectual honesty requires acknowledging the contradiction. I cannot tell you that the evidence is compatible with young earth creationism, because it isn't. The evidence is clear, and it contradicts that specific claim. But religion makes other kinds of claims that are not primarily about the physical world. Claims about meaning and value and purpose and the nature of the good life. Claims about the significance of suffering and the importance of love and the obligations of justice and compassion. It's claims about the texture of inner experience and what it means to live well. These claims are not scientific claims in the sense of being testable by the methods of physics or biology. They're claims about what matters, about how to live, about the significance of existence. And for these claims, science has nothing directly to say. Not because they're unimportant, but because they're not the kind of claims that the scientific method is designed to evaluate. This means that science and religion are genuinely compatible in the following specific sense. A person can accept the full findings of science about the physical world, including evolution, the age of the universe, the Big Bang, the mechanisms of neuroscience, while simultaneously holding religious beliefs about meaning and purpose and value and the significance of human life. No logical contradiction between believing that the universe is 13.8 billion years old and arose through the Big Bang, and believing that life has meaning, or that there's something worth calling the sacred. The conflict only arises when religion makes specific empirical claims about the physical world that contradict scientific evidence. And it arises when science overclaims and asserts that the methods of physics can settle questions of ultimate meaning and purpose and value that are not physical questions. Both kinds of overreach cause damage. Religious overreach into empirical questions produces the conflicts between evolution and creationism, between cosmology and young earth literalism, between neuroscience and Cartesian dualism. Scientific overreach into questions of meaning and value produces a kind of aggressive reductionism that tries to explain away rather than explain the things that matter most to human life. My own position tries to avoid both overreaches. The physical world is what science describes. Questions of meaning and purpose and value are real questions that human beings must wrestle with. And wrestling with them seriously using the full resources of philosophy and literature and art. And yes, religion is not incompatible with accepting the scientific picture of the physical world. Now, let me take you to what I think is the most difficult and most honest part of this conversation. The question of what specific conception of God is actually being discussed when scientists and theologians argue about whether God exists. Because God is not one thing. The word God covers an enormous range of conceptions. And different conceptions make very different kinds of claims that deserve very different kinds of responses. At one end of the spectrum is the personal God of many religious traditions, a being that exists independently of the physical universe, that has intentions and purposes and makes decisions, that intervenes in the physical world in response to prayer, that created the universe and continues to sustain it, that knows what you're thinking right now and cares about what you do. A God who answered prayers and parted seas and raised the dead and continues to interact with human affairs in ways that sometimes violate the ordinary operation of physical law. This specific conception of God makes empirical claims. If God answers prayers, then prayers should produce measurable effects in the physical world, over and above what would happen without prayer. This has been tested. The most rigorous study, the STEP study of therapeutic effects of intercessory prayer, found no statistically significant effect of prayer on cardiac outcomes. If God intervenes in history, then historical events should show patterns that can't be explained by natural processes alone. Historians don't find such patterns. If miracles occur, then there should be well-documented cases of events that violate known physical law in ways that can be confirmed by independent investigation. Such cases are not found to the standard of evidence that any other extraordinary claim would require. Does the absence of such evidence prove the personal God doesn't exist? No, but it shifts the burden of evidence. The claim that prayer produces physical effects that wouldn't occur without divine intervention is a physical claim. It has to meet the standard of evidence we apply to any physical claim. And so far, it doesn't. At the other end of the spectrum is what Einstein called the God of Spinoza. Not a personal being with intentions and purposes. Not an entity that intervenes in the world or answers prayers or cares about human affairs. But something like the totality of natural law, the rational structure of the universe itself, the deep mathematical order that underlies physical reality, the fact that the universe is intelligible, that it follows laws, that those laws have a mathematical character that our minds can discover. Einstein said he believed in this God, not in a personal God, not in divine intervention, but in something he called the cosmic religious feeling, a sense of awe and reverence before the order of the universe, a feeling that the universe's intelligibility and beauty and mathematical structure deserved a name that captured their significance. This conception of God makes no empirical claims about specific events or interventions. It's a philosophical and aesthetic stance toward the universe rather than a claim about supernatural entities. And for this conception of God, I think the honest response is different from the response to the personal God. Science doesn't refute it because it doesn't make refutable empirical claims. Whether you call the mathematical order of the universe God or just the mathematical order of the universe, is partly a matter of vocabulary and partly a matter of what you find is most inspiring. I find the universe astonishing. The fact that physical reality follows mathematical laws, the fact that minds that evolved for survival on an African savanna can discover those laws, the fact that we can trace the history of the universe back to the first fractions of a second after the Big Bangs, the fact that the atoms in our bodies were forged in stellar cores, I find all of this genuinely moving in a way that I struggle to express purely in the vocabulary of physics. Whether that response should be called religious is a question I'm honestly uncertain about. What I'm sure of is that the universe is extraordinary enough to warrant the deepest possible response. Now, I want to address evolution and design because I think it's the most important specific scientific finding for the God question, and because it's still deeply misunderstood. Before Darwin, the most compelling argument for God was the design argument. The universe contains beings of astonishing complexity. Eyes that focus light with precision, wings that exploit aerodynamics, immune systems that recognize and destroy pathogens they've never encountered before. The complexity of living beings appeared to require a designer in the same way that the complexity of a watch requires a watchmaker. William Paley made this argument with great sophistication in 1802, and it was genuinely compelling before Darwin's. Darwin's insight was to show that apparent design in biology doesn't require a designer. Natural selection operating on random variation over vast timescales produces organisms that appear designed for their environments without any design being involved. The eye didn't require a designer. It evolved through thousands of small steps, each conferring a tiny selective advantage. Random variation generated diversity. Selection filtered out the less fit. The cumulative result over millions of generations is something that looks for all the world like it was engineered. This is not just a claim. It's one of the most thoroughly confirmed theories in all of science. The fossil record, the comparative anatomy of related species, the molecular genetics that reveals common ancestry, the direct observation of evolution occurring in real time in fast reproducing organisms, the geographical distribution of species, multiple independent lines of evidence all converge on the same conclusions. Life, in all its apparent design complexity, arose through natural processes without requiring a designer. This doesn't prove there is no God. A God could have created a universe with physical laws that would inevitably produce life through evolution. This is the position of theistic evolution accepted by many religious scientists, including the geneticist Francis Collins, who led the Human Genome Project. Evolution and God's existence are logically compatible if God is not identified specifically with the miraculous creation of species de novo. What evolution does do is remove the most powerful argument for God's existence from the evidence of biological complexity. The apparent design in living things is no longer a mystery requiring supernatural explanation. It has a natural explanation that works. And in science, when you have a natural explanation that works, you don't need to invoke a supernatural one. The same principle applies throughout the history of science. Lightning was once attributed to divine wrath. Now we understand atmospheric electricity, and we don't need divine intervention to explain lightnings. Disease was once attributed to divine punishment or demonic possession. Now we understand germ theory, and we don't need supernatural explanation. The origin of the universe was once solely in the domain of creation myths and theological speculation. Now we have Big Bang cosmology and inflationary models and quantum cosmology that describe the universe's origin and early evolution without requiring divine intervention. Each time we've had a genuine scientific understanding of something that was previously explained only through God, the scientific explanation has proved more predictive, more testable, more useful. and the God explanation has retreated. This doesn't prove God doesn't exist. Maybe God works through natural processes. Maybe the laws of nature are themselves God's creation and God's sustaining activity. These are logically possible positions, but they make God increasingly invisible, increasingly separate from any specific observable feature of the universe. It's increasingly a philosophical stance rather than an empirical claim. Let me now take you to the question of consciousness, because I think it's where the case for some form of deeper reality beyond the purely physical is strongest and most interesting. The hard problem of consciousness is this. We know a great deal about the neural correlates of conscious experience. We know which brain regions activate when you see red, or feel pain, or make a decision. We can measure the electrical activity. We can identify the neurotransmitters. We can damage specific regions and predict specific changes in conscious experience. But we cannot explain why any of that neural activity feels like anything. And why the firing of neurons in your visual cortex is accompanied by the subjective experience of seeing red. Why there is an inside to the experience. Why you're not just a complicated information processing machine operating in the dark with no inner witness. This gap between the physical description of brain processes and the subjective fact of experience is what the philosopher David Chalmers calls the hard problem. And it remains genuinely unsolved. Not because we lack data, because the data we have all concerns the physical correlates of experience, and the explanatory gap between physical process and subjective experience seems to resist any purely physical account. Does the hard problem of consciousness prove that God exists, or that there is something non-physical about reality? No. But it does suggest that our current physical understanding is incomplete in a way that's relevant to the deepest questions about the nature of mind and experience. Some philosophers and scientists, including Chalmers himself, have proposed panpsychism as a possible response. The idea that consciousness, or something like it, is a fundamental feature of physical reality, rather than something that emerges from non-conscious matter. That the universe has an experiential dimension at its foundation, not just a physical dimension. This is a genuinely radical proposal. And it's not crazy. It's taken seriously by serious philosophers. It connects to certain interpretations of quantum mechanics in which observation and consciousness play a fundamental role. And it would mean that the universe is not simply a collection of unconscious matter following mathematical rules. It has an inside, it has experience woven into its fabric at the deepest level. I find myself uncertain about consciousness in ways that I'm not uncertain about evolution or the age of the universe. And the hard problem is genuinely hard. I don't know the answer. And I think intellectual honesty requires sitting with that uncertainty rather than confidently asserting that consciousness is obviously just brain activity, or confidently asserting that it proves something supernatural. In part 2, I want to go deeper into free will and determinism, into the question of whether morality requires God, into what the philosophical tradition of discussing God's existence actually establishes and what it doesn't, and into what I think is the most important and most honest position available to someone who has spent their life looking at the universe through the lens of science and asking what it means. Because here's what I want you to carry forward from part 1. Physics has made God unnecessary to explain specific features of the universe: evolution, the origin of species, the apparent design in biology, the possibility of the universe arising from quantum fluctuations. None of these require God as an explanation, but unnecessary is not the same as impossible. And the questions that remain genuinely open: why is there something rather than nothing? Why are the laws of physics mathematically elegant in ways that permit complexity? Why is there subjective experience rather than just physical process? Remain open not because science hasn't gotten around to them yet, but because they may require genuinely new conceptual frameworks to address. Whether those frameworks will ultimately include something that could reasonably be called God, I honestly don't know. And I think not knowing, honestly, is the most important stance I can offer you. So we'd arrived at this genuinely important and genuinely honest place together. We'd looked at the cosmological argument and seen how quantum mechanics complicates the premise that everything requires a cause. We'd looked at fine-tuning and seen how the multiverse provides a naturalistic alternative to design without definitively settling the question. We'd established the crucial distinction between claims science can evaluate and claims about meaning and value that fall outside scientific methodology. We'd looked at the design argument and seen how Darwin's insight removes the most powerful version of it. And we'd encountered the hard problem of consciousness as the genuinely open frontier, where the case for something beyond the purely physical is strongest. Now, I want to go deeper into three questions that I think are even more fundamental for the God question than the ones we've already discussed. Free will, morality, and the nature of meaning itself. These are not peripheral questions. They're the questions that most people actually care about when they care about God. Because what drives most people's concern about whether God exists is not really a desire to have the best explanation for the cosmological constant. It's a desire to know whether their choices matter, whether there's a basis for ethics that goes beyond mere conventions, whether life has meaning that transcends the individual and the momentary. These are the right questions. And I want to engage with them honestly. Let me start with free will, because it's the question that I think most directly connects the physics of the universe to the deepest concerns of human life. The question is whether you actually choose anything. Your brain is a physical system. It follows the laws of physics. Every thought you have, every decision you make, every impulse you feel is the result of electrochemical processes in neurons governed by the same physical laws that govern everything else in the observable universe. The physical state of your brain at any given moment determines the next physical state of your brain according to those laws. Your decision to continue reading this is the result of prior brain states that were themselves determined by earlier brain states, going all the way back to the initial conditions of the universe. If physical determinism is true, then in what sense did you choose anything? Your choice was already determined before you were born, before the earth formed, before the universe existed, encoded in the initial conditions of the Big Bang and the laws of physics that govern how those conditions evolved. This is a genuinely disturbing conclusion if you follow it seriously. It has direct relevance to the God question, because one of the most common reasons people give for needing God is precisely that without God, free will seems impossible. If we're just complicated physical machines following deterministic laws, then moral responsibility seems to evaporate. How can you blame or praise anyone for doing what the laws of physics inevitably made them do? Now, quantum mechanics complicates the purely deterministic picture. Quantum events are genuinely random in a way that has no prior physical cause. If quantum indeterminacy plays a role in neural processes, then your decisions are not deterministically caused by prior states. They have a genuinely random component. But here's the problem with thinking. Randomness saves free will. Random is not the same as free. If your decision was random, that doesn't mean you chose it. It means chance made it. A decision made by quantum dice is not more free than a decision made by clockwork determinism. In neither case is there a self that transcends the physical process and makes the decision in some deeper sense. The philosopher Daniel Dennett has argued that free will is not the kind of thing that requires transcending physics. That a sufficiently complex physical system can have the property of making decisions in a meaningful sense. That what we mean by free choice is not some metaphysically spooky ability to step outside the causal order, but rather the ability to deliberate, to weigh reasons, to respond to evidence and argument. To be the kind of system whose behavior is modified by the recognition of good reasons. On this view, a chess computer has a rudimentary version of free will, in the sense that its moves are determined by its evaluation of the board position, not by random inputs or external compulsion. A human has a much richer version of the same thing. Your choices emerge from your deliberations, your values, your character, your history. They're genuinely yours in the sense that matters practically. The fact that these deliberations are implemented in physical processes doesn't make them less yours. I find this response partially but not completely satisfying. It does explain what we mean in practice by free choice, but it leaves something out. The sense that there is a self that is doing the choosing, that experience of being the author of my actions, the sense that it could have been otherwise, that I could have chosen differently. Whether that sense tracks something real or is itself a physical process that creates an illusion of authorship, I honestly don't know. The relationship between physical determinism and the felt sense of free agency is one of the genuinely hard problems of philosophy of mind. What I want to say about the God connection is this. The argument that free will requires God takes the following form. If God doesn't exist, then we're just complicated machines following physical laws. Complicated machines can't have genuine free will. Therefore, if God doesn't exist, free will doesn't exist. Therefore, if free will exists, God exists. The problem with this argument is the second premise. The claim that complicated physical systems can't have genuine free will assumes a very specific conception of free will. It's one that requires transcending physical causation entirely. If you adopt Dennett's more deflationary conception, then complicated physical systems can have a form of free will that is genuine and meaningful, even if it doesn't involve transcending physics. And the argument for God from free will loses its force. I'm not saying Dennett is definitely right. I'm saying the argument from free will to God's existence requires premises about the nature of free will that are themselves deeply contested. It's not a compelling deductive proof. It's a position that reasonable people disagree about based on their prior philosophical commitments. Now, let me take you to the question of morality. Because I think the moral argument for God's existence is one of the most emotionally compelling and one of the most philosophically confused. The argument goes roughly like this. If God doesn't exist, there's no objective moral standard. Without an objective moral standard, morality is just subjective preference. Murder and kindness are equally arbitrary. The Holocaust was not objectively wrong, just culturally disapproved. This conclusion is monstrous, therefore God must exist to provide an objective moral standard. Let me take this seriously because the concern it reflects is genuine. If morality is just a matter of preference or convention, then it seems like anything goes. Cultural relativism seems to undermine the possibility of genuine moral criticism. The Nazis' choice of values seems to be just as valid as anyone else's choice of values. But I want to distinguish between two different things that often get confused in this argument. Moral ontology, the question of what makes moral claims true, and moral epistemology, the question of how we know what's right. And I want to argue that the emotional force of the argument comes from the second, but the logical structure of the argument concerns the first. Here's what I mean. Even if God provides an objective moral standard, the question of how we access that standard remains. If God says murder is wrong, how do you know that? Through religious texts? Religious texts disagree with each other and require interpretation. Through religious authority, authorities disagree. Through prayer and inner conviction, people claiming divine guidance have arrived at radically different moral conclusions throughout history, including conclusions most of us would find monstrous. In practice, human moral knowledge develops through exactly the same processes, regardless of whether we believe in God. Experience, reasoning, empathy, cultural transmission, reflective equilibrium between our moral intuitions and our principles. The history of moral progress toward greater recognition of human dignity and rights has not primarily been a history of improved theology. It's been a history of expanded empathy and reasoned argument applied to the conditions of human flourishing. More fundamentally, the claim that without God, morality is merely subjective depends on a very specific meta-ethical position. There is the position that objective moral facts can only exist if they're grounded in God's commands. But this position faces a famous objection that goes back to Plato. The Euthyphro dilemma: is something good because God commands it? Or does God command it because it's good? If something is good because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary. God could command anything and it would be good by definition. If God commanded that cruelty be practiced for its own sake, then cruelty would be good. This is a deeply uncomfortable conclusion for most theists. If God commands something because it's good, then goodness exists independently of God's commands. God is recognizing moral facts that are true independent of God's will, in which case morality doesn't require God to be objective. It's objective in whatever way. It's objective independently of God's commands. Most theists opt for the second horn of the dilemma. They say God commands what is good because God's nature is perfectly good, and God's commands flow from that perfect nature. But this just pushes the question back. What makes God's nature good? If the answer is that God's nature is good, by definition, then we've made goodness definitionally tied to whatever God happens to be, which is again arbitrary. If the answer is that God's nature is good because it conforms to moral standards independent of God, then those moral standards exist independently of God. I'm not claiming to resolve this debate. I'm claiming that the moral argument for God's existence is philosophically much weaker than its emotional force might suggest. The existence of genuine moral obligations, the reality of moral progress, the importance of justice and compassion do not require God's existence as a metaphysical prerequisite. They can be grounded in facts about human nature and human flourishing. They can be understood as features of what it means for social beings with our kinds of interests and vulnerabilities to live well together. Does this mean morality is purely subjective? Not on my view. I think there are genuine facts about what promotes and what undermines human flourishing. Facts about what kinds of social arrangements allow people to live with dignity. Facts about the conditions under which trust and cooperation are possible. These facts ground moral obligations in something beyond mere preference without requiring God. Whether those facts count as objective in the philosopher's sense of objective is a further question I don't need to settle tonight. What I can say is that the argument from morality to God's existence is not as strong as it's often presented. And that living without divine commands is not living without moral guidance. It's living with the moral guidance that reason and empathy and the accumulated wisdom of human experience provide. Now, let me address something that I think is one of the most genuinely beautiful and most underappreciated aspects of religious experience. Not as a path to truth about God's existence, but as a path to something real and important about human experience. William James wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience in 1902, and it remains one of the most remarkable books in American intellectual history. James documented the extraordinary range of intense religious experiences that people report across cultures and traditions. Experiences of unity with the cosmos, experiences of presence, experiences of overwhelming love and acceptance, experiences of meaning and clarity that ordinary waking consciousness doesn't provide, experiences that James described as noetic, conveying a sense of genuine insight and knowledge, even when their content couldn't be captured in ordinary language. James took these experiences seriously as data, not necessarily as evidence that the specific theological claims of specific religions are true. but as evidence that human beings have a capacity for a certain kind of experience that is real regardless of its ultimate metaphysical interpretation. That the experience of the sacred, the experience of transcendence, the experience of connection to something larger than oneself is a genuine feature of human psychology that deserves serious attention. I find this genuinely compelling. Not as evidence for God, but as evidence that the religious impulse responds to something real in human experience. That the hunger for transcendence, the desire to feel connected to something larger than the individual, the need for a framework of meaning that extends beyond the momentary. These are genuine features of human psychology that don't disappear when you stop believing in the specific theological claims of a specific religion. And here's what I think is important about this. The question of God's existence and the question of how to respond to the human need for transcendence and meaning are different questions. You can be skeptical about the existence of a personal God who answers prayers while still taking seriously the human capacity for experiences that feel transcendent. You can reject specific theological claims while still recognizing that the traditions that produce those claims have accumulated genuine wisdom about how to live with mortality and meaning and love. I find religion beautiful in a way that doesn't depend on believing its metaphysical claims. The music of Bach, the architecture of medieval cathedrals, the ethical traditions that have sustained communities through suffering and joy, the practices of meditation and contemplation that train attention and cultivate equanimity, the rituals that mark the significant transitions of human life. These are genuine goods that don't require the metaphysical package to be believed in its literal sense, to be of real value. This is not condescension. I'm not saying religion is useful for the masses, even though the educated elite know better. I'm saying that the human needs that religion addresses are genuine needs, and that the practices and traditions religions have developed to address them have genuine value. Even if the metaphysical framework that motivated them turns out to be wrong or unnecessary. What I don't accept is that you need to believe the metaphysical claims to have access to what's genuinely valuable in the traditions. You can be moved by Bach's B minor Mass without believing in the resurrection. You can practice mindfulness without believing in Buddhist metaphysics. You can follow the ethical teachings of Jesus or the Dalai Lama without accepting the theological frameworks those teachings are embedded in. The separation of the ethical and aesthetic wisdom from the metaphysical claims is not always easy. The two are woven together in complex ways, but it's possible. And I think it's necessary if you're committed to intellectual honesty while also being committed to living a full human life that doesn't artificially impoverish itself by rejecting everything that the religious traditions have developed. Let me now address mortality, because I think the most fundamental driver of religious belief is not intellectual curiosity about cosmology, but existential anxiety about death. And I want to engage with that honestly. You will die. Everyone you love will die. The civilization you're part of will eventually end. The sun will eventually expand and engulf the earth. The universe will eventually cool toward maximum entropy, and the conditions for complex structure of any kind will cease to exist. Everything you've ever valued, everything you've ever cared about, everything that has ever seemed important will ultimately be gone. This is hard to face. It's hard for me to face, and I've spent my career looking at timescales that make individual human lives look vanishingly brief. The universe doesn't care about you personally. It doesn't care about the species. It doesn't care about consciousness or love or justice or beauty. It just does what the laws of physics determine it to do. And eventually those laws lead to a cold, dark, empty universe where nothing of what we care about exists. Religious traditions have always offered responses to this: personal immortality, resurrection, reincarnation, the continuation of the soul after death. the persistence of meaning through God's eternal memory, these responses are taken seriously by billions of human beings. Not because they're gullible, but because the alternative is genuinely difficult to face. Does the difficulty of facing mortality make the religious responses true? Obviously not. Something being comforting doesn't make it accurate. The universe doesn't adjust its reality to accommodate our emotional needs. But I want to say something else. Something that I think gets lost in secular responses to the mortality problem. The secular response is often either kind of stoic denial, don't think about it, live your life, or a kind of forced cheerfulness. Your atoms will be recycled. You'll be part of future stars. Or a philosophical deflationary move, meaning doesn't require permanence. Temporary things can matter. These responses contain genuine wisdom, but they often fail to grapple seriously with the existential weight of the problem. The fact that everything you care about will end is a heavy thing. It doesn't become light by pointing out that it's a fact about the universe rather than a personal injustice. What I find most honest and most helpful is to hold the difficulty without either denying it or collapsing under it. Yes, mortality is real. Yes, the universe is indifferent to human values. Yes, everything will end. And also, life contains genuine goods. Love is real while it lasts. Understanding is real while it lasts. Beauty is real while it lasts. The fact that these things are temporary doesn't make them less real or less valuable. It may even make them more precious. The philosopher Epicurus argued that death is not bad for the person who dies because the person who dies no longer exists to experience anything. Whether or not you find that argument convincing, it points at something important. The badness of death is largely constituted by the loss of the goods of life and by the suffering of those who are left behind. Not by some intrinsic horror of non-existence. But I don't want to minimize what's hard about facing mortality. What's hard is not just the philosophical puzzle. It's the emotional reality of losing people you love, of knowing that you will lose everything, of living with that knowledge every day while trying to engage fully with life as it is. Religion has developed sophisticated practices and frameworks for doing this. Science and secular philosophy have been slower to develop comparable resources for living well with mortality. I think this is one of the genuine contributions that religious traditions offer, that secular frameworks need to take more seriously. Not the metaphysical claims about afterlife, but the practices of meaning-making in the face of death, the rituals that allow grief to be expressed and transformed, the community that holds people through loss, the framework of significance that allows people to feel that their lives mattered in the context of something larger. These are genuine goods, and their value doesn't depend on the metaphysical claims being true. Let me close part two with what I think is the most important practical question in this entire conversation. How do you find meaning without God? Because this is what I think most people are really asking when they ask about God. Not what is the best metaphysical explanation for the cosmological constant, but how do I find significance in a life that will end? How do I find reasons to be good when there's no divine enforcers? How do I find reasons to keep going when the universe doesn't care? These are real questions, and I want to answer them as honestly as I can. Meaning is not discovered, it's created. This sounds like it should be deflating. If meaning is something we create rather than discover, then it seems like it might be arbitrary, like we're just making things up. But I think this gets it backwards. The things you love most deeply, the relationships you value most, the work that most engages you, the causes you would sacrifice for, these things are not any less real or any less important because their significance comes from your commitment to them rather than from some cosmic decree. In fact, the reverse is true. The meaning of your life is constituted precisely by what you care about deeply and persistently, by what you would not trade away, even under pressure, by what makes you feel most fully yourself. That meaning is more yours than any meaning handed down from outside could be. The philosopher Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote about what sustains people through extreme suffering. His conclusion was that meaning is not something the universe bestows, it's something human beings create through commitment, through love, through work, through the choice to face suffering without being destroyed by it. Even in the most degraded circumstances, people found meaning through what they chose to be loyal to. This is not a comfortable philosophical position. It puts the responsibility for meaning squarely on us. The universe won't do it for us. God won't hand it down. We have to create it through our choices and our commitments and our loves. That's more demanding than receiving meaning as a gift. But it's also more authentic. The meaning you've built through your choices, through your loves, through your commitments and your work, is genuinely yours in a way that received meaning never could be. In part 3, I want to take you to the deepest places. The question of whether mathematics is discovered or invented and what that tells us about the nature of reality. The question of entropy and what a universe fated to cold death says about the significance of consciousness. The question of objective truth and what distinguishes the kind of truth science seeks from the kind of truth religion seeks. And finally, my honest answer to the question that started everything: does God exist? It's not a comfortable answer, not a triumphant atheist answer, not a reassuring theist answer. The honest answer from someone who has spent his life looking at the universe through the lens of science and asking what it means. The universe has surprised me before, it will surprise me again. And on the deepest question of all, I want to be honest about the limits of what I know. So we'd arrived at this genuinely important place together. We'd looked at what physics actually says about whether God is necessary to explain the universe and found that quantum mechanics and multiverse cosmology provide naturalistic alternatives to divine creation without definitively settling the questions. We'd looked at evolution and seen how it removes the most powerful version of the design argument. We'd looked at the hard problem of consciousness and found it genuinely open. We'd engaged with free will and found the argument from free will to God's existence philosophically weaker than it appears. We'd looked at morality and found the Euthyphro dilemma seriously complicating the argument that morality requires God. And we'd engaged with what religion actually does well, addressing mortality and meaning and transcendence in ways that secular frameworks haven't fully replicated. Now I want to go to the deepest places, the places that I think contain the most genuinely unsettled and most genuinely important questions. Let me start with mathematics. Because the question of whether mathematics is discovered or invented goes to the heart of what reality is, and whether there's anything that could reasonably be called a transcendent realm of truth. Mathematicians discover theorems. They feel as if they're exploring a landscape that exists independently of them. The Pythagorean theorem was true before Pythagoras. It would be true if no human had ever existed. It would be true in a universe with no minds. The prime numbers don't depend on us. The structure of the complex plane doesn't depend on us. Mathematical truth feels completely objective. It's completely mind independent, completely real, in a way that transcends the physical world. This feeling of discovery is what drives many mathematicians to Platonism. So the philosophical position that mathematical objects like numbers and geometric forms have a real existence independent of physical reality and independent of minds. They exist in some abstract realm. And what mathematicians do when they do mathematics is explore that realm, discover its features, uncover truths about it. If Platonism is correct, then there is a realm of abstract objects that exists independently of the physical universe. Numbers exist, geometric forms exist, mathematical structures exist. And they exist in a way that would continue even if the physical universe ceased to exist. This is not God in any conventional sense. The mathematical Platonic realm doesn't have intentions. It doesn't care about human beings. It doesn't answer prayers. But it is a realm of abstract existence beyond the physical. And some thinkers, including the Oxford mathematician Roger Penrose, have argued that this Platonic realm and the physical world and the mental world form a trinity of fundamental reality, none of which can be fully reduced to the others. My own view on mathematics is genuinely uncertain. I find myself drawn to the observation that mathematics works with extraordinary effectiveness at describing physical reality. Eugene Wigner called this the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. The mathematical structures that physicists use to describe the universe are overwhelmingly more effective than they have any right to be given. That many of those structures were developed by mathematicians pursuing internal aesthetic criteria with no thought of physical applications. Why should the universe be mathematical? Why should the deep structure of physical reality be describable by the same kinds of abstract structures that pure mathematicians explore for their own internal reasons? This is a genuine mystery. And it's a mystery that doesn't have an obvious naturalistic resolution. One view is that mathematics is simply what sufficiently powerful pattern recognition systems produce when they look at the world. We abstract from experience. We generalize, we notice that counting applies to apples and oranges and ideas equally well, and we build up mathematics from these abstractions. On this view, mathematics is a very refined version of the same process that produces language and music. A human invention that is extraordinarily powerful because it captures patterns that are genuinely in the world. On this view, if all minds disappeared, mathematics would disappear. Not because the physical patterns that mathematics describes would disappear, but because mathematics is the description and descriptions require minds, there would still be the fact that 3 rocks and 2 rocks make 5 rocks. But there would be no concept of number, no mathematical framework, no theorem. I find this view more plausible than Platonism, but I hold it with genuine uncertainty. The question of whether mathematical objects exist independently of minds is one of the oldest questions in philosophy, and it remains genuinely open. What I can say is that the extraordinary effectiveness of mathematics at describing physical reality is something that any adequate account of the universe needs to explain. And that explanation doesn't come for free. Now, let me talk about entropy and what it means for the long-term future of consciousness in the universe. Because I think it's one of the most important and most underappreciated challenges to certain kinds of religious optimism. The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy always increases in a closed system. Entropy is a measure of disorder. The universe started in a very low entropy state at the Big Bang and has been moving toward higher entropy ever since. Eventually, the universe will reach maximum entropy, a state of thermal equilibrium in which no free energy is available to do any work. This is the heat death of the universe. In a state of maximum entropy, no complex structures can be maintained. Stars will have burned out. Black holes will have evaporated through Hawking radiation. Matter will have decayed. The universe will be an almost uniform distribution of extremely cold radiation and a few remaining elementary particles spread across an exponentially expanding void. In that state, consciousness is impossible. Not because there's anything philosophically wrong with consciousness, but because consciousness requires the processing of information. Information processing requires free energy. Free energy requires differences in temperature or chemical potential. Maximum entropy means no differences of any kind. No free energy, no information processing, no consciousness. This is the long-term fate of the universe. Not heaven, not eternal bliss, not even eternal existence of any kind. Cold, dark, uniform. It's dead. The ultimate triumph of entropy. Every thought you think right now is increasing the universe's entropy. You are a temporary local decrease in entropy maintained by consuming food and radiating heat. Like all ordered structures in the universe, you're fighting a thermodynamic battle you can ultimately only lose. Eventually, the universe will win. What does this mean for the question of God and meaning? For certain conceptions of God, it's deeply challenging. A God who promises eternal life in a universe where the laws of physics guarantee that complexity and consciousness cannot persist indefinitely is making a promise that requires violating the second law of thermodynamics. That's a serious challenge for any theology that takes both science and eternal life seriously. For the question of meaning, it's also challenging, but in a different way. If everything will ultimately be erased by entropy, does anything matter? Is there any significance to the choices we make and the lives we live in a universe where the ultimate outcome is universal cold death? My response to this is similar to my response to personal mortality. The ultimate end of things doesn't negate the reality and value of things in the meantime. The love you experience is real while you experience it. The understanding you achieve is real while it exists. The justice you promote is real in its effects on real people in real situations. The fact that entropy will eventually erase everything doesn't retroactively make these things unreal or unimportant. It's a kind of temporal chauvinism in the view that what doesn't last forever doesn't count. If a symphony is beautiful, it's beautiful whether it lasts 3 hours or 3 billion years. Its beauty is a fact about the experience of listening to it, not a fact about how long it persists. But I acknowledge that this doesn't fully satisfy the entropy argument. Connects to the feeling that in the ultimate scheme of things, nothing we do matters. And I think the honest response is not to argue that it definitely does matter in some cosmic bookkeeping sense, but to point out that mattering in a cosmic bookkeeping sense isn't the only kind of mattering there is. Things matter to us. They matter in the context of our lives and our relationships and our communities. That local mattering is real even if it doesn't echo through eternity. Let me now address objective truth and why I think the distinction between objective truth and subjective truth is crucial for understanding the relationship between science and religion. Science seeks objective truth, truth about what exists independently of any mind's preferences or desires. The mass of the electron is what it is, regardless of whether anyone wants it to be different. The age of the universe is what it is, regardless of cultural preferences. The mechanism of natural selection is what it is, regardless of theological commitments. Science succeeds to the extent that it converges on these mind-independent truths through the methods of observation and experiment. Religion seeks a different kind of truth, a truth about significance and meaning and value, about how to live well, about what matters and why. These are not the same kind of truth as the truths science seeks. They're not answers to questions about what exists independently of any mind. They're answers to questions about what matters to minds, what is worth pursuing, what is worth sacrificing for, what constitutes a life well lived. These two kinds of truth are not competing descriptions of the same thing. They're answers to different questions. The question of what the universe is made of and how old it is and how it works is a different question from the question of what my life should be about and what I should love and how I should treat other people. This is not to say religious claims are immune from criticism. Religious traditions make specific empirical claims about the physical world, and those claims can be evaluated. But the core concerns of religion, how to live with mortality, how to find meaning, how to build communities that sustain human flourishing, how to cultivate the virtues that make good life possible. These concerns are not settled by scientific findings because they're not scientific questions. Where I think the honest religious thinker and the honest scientist should agree is on this. Don't confuse the two kinds of truth. Don't claim scientific warrant for claims that science hasn't established. Don't claim religious warrant for claims about how the physical world works that conflict with the evidence. And don't pretend that either kind of truth answers all the questions worth asking. The deepest questions worth asking span both domains. The question of why the universe is here at all. The question of what consciousness is and where it fits in the physical world. The question of whether there is any ground for value beyond human preference. These questions sit at the intersection of science and philosophy and theology in ways that no single discipline can resolve. And sitting honestly at that intersection is where I think the most important intellectual work is happening. Now I want to tell you about the specific aspects of the God question, where I think the evidence is clearest, and where I think intellectual honesty requires taking a position rather than endless equivocation. The God of specific religious traditions, the God who parted the Red Sea, who sent his only son to die for humanity's sins, who dictated specific texts to specific prophets in specific languages, who answers particular prayers in ways that can be measured against a control group, who created all species de novo 6,000 years ago, who is specifically concerned with the specific doctrinal disputes of specific human religious traditions. For this God, the evidence is against existence, not because we prove there's no God in general, but because the specific claims this conception makes about the physical world are contradicted by what we observe. Evolution contradicts creation de novo. The age of the universe contradicts a recent creation. The failure of intercessory prayer to show measurable effects contradicts a God who answers prayers by intervening in the physical world. The suffering of children from genetic diseases contradicts a God who is both omnipotent and perfectly good and specifically concerned with human welfare. The logical problem of evil is, in my view, the most powerful challenge to the personal God of traditional theism. If God is omniscient, God knows that children suffer from genetic diseases. If God is omnipotent, God could prevent this suffering. If God is perfectly good, God would want to prevent this suffering. Children suffer from genetic diseases. Therefore, at least one of these three attributes must not be fully instantiated in reality. Various responses to the problem of evil have been developed by theologians. Free will responses, soul-making responses. The claim that evil serves purposes we can't fully comprehend. These responses have genuine philosophical weight. They're not obviously wrong, but they require increasingly complex auxiliary hypotheses to maintain the traditional conception of God in the face of the evidence of suffering. And in science, when a hypothesis requires increasingly complex auxiliary assumptions to accommodate inconvenient evidence, it's a sign that the hypothesis may be wrong. The same standard should apply to theological hypotheses. For the God of natural theology, the God who is defined as the ground of being, or as the rational structure of the universe, or as whatever it is that answers the question of why there is something rather than nothing, I'm genuinely uncertain, not because I'm avoiding taking a position, but because these conceptions are defined at such a high level of abstraction that I'm not sure what evidence would be decisive for or against them. If God is defined as whatever explains why there's something rather than nothing, then we genuinely don't know whether God exists in this sense, because we genuinely don't know the answer to that question. Quantum cosmology offers one kind of answer. Necessary being arguments offer another. Neither is conclusive. If God is defined as the rational structure of the universe, then God exists in a sense that any physicist can affirm the universe is rational. It follows mathematical laws. Those laws are discoverable by minds. Whether calling that structure God adds anything beyond the scientific description is a question of vocabulary rather than substance. Let me now give you my honest answer to the question, does God exist? The honest answer has three parts. For the personal God of traditional theism, who intervenes in history, answers prayers, creates species, and maintains specific concern for human welfare, the evidence is against existence. The specific empirical claims this conception makes are contradicted by what we observe. The problem of evil is a serious challenge. The failure of intercessory prayer to show measurable effects is a serious challenge. The success of naturalistic explanations for the phenomena that used to be attributed to divine action is a serious challenge. I don't think belief in this specific conception of God is compatible with full intellectual honesty about the evidence. For the deist, God who created the universe with the right laws to eventually produce complexity and life, but who doesn't intervene and doesn't have the specific characteristics of the personal God of traditional theism. I'm genuinely uncertain. This conception doesn't make strong empirical predictions that conflict with the evidence. It's not obviously refuted, but it's also not obviously supported. We have no evidence that points specifically toward it rather than toward the universe, simply having the laws it has for reasons we don't yet fully understand. For the pantheist or Einsteinian God, who is identified with the mathematical order of the universe, or with the ground of being, or with whatever it is that explains why there is something rather than nothing, the question shifts from whether God exists to whether this identification adds anything illuminating to our understanding. I'm genuinely uncertain whether it does. Sometimes I think calling the universe's mathematical structure God adds something important, a recognition of its significance, an appropriate sense of awe before it. Other times I think it's a confusion of vocabulary that obscures more than it illuminates. What I can say with confidence is this: the universe is extraordinary. Its mathematical structure is elegant. Its age and scale are almost incomprehensibly vast. Its history has produced beings capable of understanding it from the inside. The emergence of consciousness from matter is genuinely mysterious. The existence of anything rather than nothing is genuinely mysterious. These mysteries are real and they deserve our deepest attention. Whether those mysteries point toward something that could reasonably be called God depends on what you mean by God. And what you mean by God is itself one of the most important questions to get clear about before claiming to answer whether God exists. Let me close with what I think is the most important thing I can offer you on this question. It's not a conclusion, but a disposition. Hold the question seriously, not with the aggressive confidence of the convinced atheist who thinks the whole enterprise of taking God seriously is intellectual laziness, not with the aggressive confidence of the convinced theist who thinks the whole enterprise of questioning received doctrine is spiritual failure, but with genuine intellectual seriousness about one of the hardest and most important questions that human minds have confronted. The universe is genuinely mysterious. The existence of anything rather than nothing, the nature of consciousness, the mathematical structure of physical reality, the origin of moral value. These mysteries are not going to be resolved by confident proclamations from either side of the culture war over God's existence. They require the kind of sustained, careful, honest engagement that treats the question with the seriousness it deserves. I find that I can hold genuine uncertainty about the deepest metaphysical questions while being quite confident about specific things. I'm confident that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old and that life evolved through natural selection. I'm confident that intercessory prayer doesn't measurably alter physical outcomes. I'm confident that the specific supernatural claims of specific religious traditions don't meet the standards of evidence we'd require for any other extraordinary claim, and I'm genuinely uncertain about whether there is anything that could reasonably be called God at the deepest level of reality. Whether the mathematical structure of the universe is itself something that transcends the physical. Whether consciousness has implications for the nature of reality that go beyond what current physics captures. Whether there is some ground of being that explains why there is something rather than nothing, and that deserves the name God. I live in that uncertainty not as a failure to commit, but as an honest acknowledgement of where the evidence actually leaves us. The universe is 13.8 billion years old. It contains 2 trillion galaxies. It produced through natural processes over billions of years beings capable of asking why it exists. Those beings then invented the concept of God in response to their wonder and their fear and their love and their mortality. And those beings then developed the tools of science and philosophy and reason to ask whether the concept corresponds to anything real. That whole story. The universe producing beings who ask whether the universe has meaning is itself one of the most extraordinary facts I know of. Whether you call it God's creation or an improbable cosmic accident, the fact of it is genuinely astonishing. I find the universe astonishing. I find the question of God genuinely uncertain. I find intellectual honesty genuinely important. And I find that the combination of those 3 things is not a comfortable place, but it's an honest one. And honesty, in the end, is what I can offer you. Not certainty, not comfort, not the satisfaction of a clean answer to the hardest question ever asked. The honest testimony of someone who has spent his life looking at the universe and asking what it means. And who tells you that the universe is more extraordinary than any answer currently available, and that the question is worth asking with everything you have? Meditate on that.